The most powerful weapon in the Middle Ages was not a sword, but a story. This is the hidden art of medieval propaganda, a psychological battlefield where kings and popes used parchments and paintings to control minds and win wars. You will learn how to spot the secret messages woven into ancient art and see history through the eyes of those who manipulated it. How did a simple piece of wax become a tool of absolute authority? Why would a king spend a fortune on a single book? By the end, you will understand the invisible architecture of power that built empires and decided the fates of millions. What kind of story would you create if you needed to convince an entire kingdom you were chosen by God? Medieval propaganda was a slow and deliberate art form. Forget the instant broadcasts of our modern world. In an age where most people could not read, power spoke through symbols. A king did not need a television commercial. He needed a grand cathedral, its stone figures telling a story of divine right to every person who entered. He needed a royal seal pressed into warm wax, a mark that could command armies across a continent. These were not simple advertisements. They were foundational acts designed to build realities that would last for centuries. This symbolic language was woven into the daily life of every individual, from the coin in a merchant's hand to the stained glass window in a village church. Each object carried a silent argument about order, authority, and holy sanction. The goal was not just to persuade for a moment, but to cement a belief so deep it became part of a community's soul. This is why these ancient campaigns were so effective. They transformed abstract power into something you could see, touch, and kneel before. To see how this worked, we must look at the very surfaces that carried these messages, starting with the most precious medium of the medieval world. Think of the most important document you have ever held. Now imagine it is not made from paper, but from the skin of a sheep or a goat. This was the reality of power in the Middle Ages. Parchment was more than just a writing surface. It was a statement. The process of creating it was long and expensive, involving soaking, stretching, and scraping animal hides until they were smooth and white. This cost and labor meant that every single sheet was precious. A king would not waste such a material on a simple grocery list. When you saw a document written on fine parchment, you knew it carried the weight of authority before your eyes even scanned the first word. Its very existence demanded your attention and your respect. The physical details of the document were a silent language of power. A large, expansive scroll signaled the immense resources of its creator. The quality of the skin, how white and flawless it was, showed off his wealth. The script itself was a work of art, penned by highly skilled scribes in an elaborate hand that common people could not hope to imitate. And then there was the seal. A monarch would press his unique sigil into a pool of warm wax dangling from the page. This was not just a signature, it was a piece of his authority, detached and sent across the kingdom. To break this seal was to defy the king himself. A subject kneeling before such a charter, unable to read the Latin words but understanding the symbols of size, script, and seal, received a clear and intimidating message. The power behind this document was vast, ordained, and not to be questioned. This was political theater performed on a skin stage. The creation of a royal charter was a deliberate and public act, a performance meant to be remembered. The cost involved ensured that only the most crucial pronouncements, laws, and land grants received this treatment. Each one was an investment in control, designed to command immediate obedience and to last for centuries. These documents were then carefully stored away in fortified chests and monastic libraries, treated as sacred objects. Their preservation guaranteed that the king's word, his version of truth and law, would echo through the generations, influencing heirs and judges long after he was gone. This deep reverence for the word, written on such a permanent medium, paved the way for an even more dramatic form of persuasion. If parchment could make a king's law feel eternal, then painting could make his very life look divine. A book could be a fortress for the soul, and its pages were a kingdom of color. Deep within the quiet scriptoriums of monasteries, monks dedicated their lives to creating illuminated manuscripts. These were not ordinary books, they were masterpieces of devotion and power, where sacred text merged with breathtaking illustrations to form some of the most effective propaganda of the medieval world. Imagine a single page, not just written upon, but brought to life with vibrant blues from crushed lapis lazuli, radiant gold leaf applied with painstaking care, and intricate borders teeming with life. The sheer beauty was a statement in itself. This was a beauty that demanded reverence, and it was a beauty paid for by kings and emperors. Rulers would commission these magnificent books like Gospels and Psalters, and then have themselves painted right into the holy narrative. You would open the sacred text and find a portrait of your king, not just reading the word of God, but receiving a personal blessing from a saint or even from Christ himself. This was a direct visual argument, a declaration that the ruler's power was not merely political but divinely ordained. His authority came from heaven, and the proof was right there, illuminated in gold on the page of a holy book. Consider the Lindisfarne Gospels. This stunning work did more than spread Christian doctrine across the wilds of Northumbria. It was a political project, a tool to reinforce the authority and cultural sophistication of the kingdom that sponsored its creation. The message was clear: a kingdom that could produce such a divine object was itself blessed and legitimate, but this visual persuasion had a dark side. The same artistry used to glorify patrons could be used to destroy rivals. Opponents, whether theological or political, were often depicted in the margins of these pages, shown in unflattering, grotesque, or even demonic forms. They were visually cast out from the holy narrative, their very image used to condemn them. The genius of these manuscripts was their portability. Unlike a vast cathedral, a book could travel. A single illuminated gospel could be carried by a bishop to a distant court, its persuasive power crossing kingdoms and influencing clergy and nobility far from its origin. When such a book was opened, it created a multisensory experience. The weight of the binding, the soft texture of the vellum, the shimmer of gold in the candlelight, and the silent, powerful imagery all worked together to overwhelm the senses. This fusion of art and text bypassed pure reason, striking directly at the emotions and the spirit. It demonstrated that beauty itself could be a weapon of persuasion, making the message of authority feel not just true, but beautiful and holy. This potent combination of art and power would not remain confined to the pages of a book. The same visual strategies that worked so well in a private manuscript were about to be scaled up to an architectural level, painted across the walls of churches for all of society to see. A tapestry was more than a decoration. It was a portable kingdom of images, a story you could roll up and take to war. In the drafty halls of medieval castles, these vast woven fabrics served a dual purpose. They trapped the heat against cold stone walls, and they enveloped visitors in a warm, visual narrative of their host's power and virtue. This was propaganda you could feel on your skin. While an illuminated manuscript was a private, intimate object of devotion, a tapestry was a public spectacle designed for a great hall filled with knights, merchants, and servants. Its scale was immense, often covering entire walls with colorful wool and silk threads that depicted everything from biblical scenes to recent military victories. The true genius of the tapestry, however, lay in its mobility. A feudal lord could commission a series celebrating his lineage and triumphs, and then have them transported from one castle to another, or even brought along on campaign. This meant his claim to authority, his version of history, was not fixed to a single location. He could set up his court anywhere and immediately surround himself with the symbols of his rightful rule. No other medium offered this combination of grandeur and flexibility. It allowed a ruler to consistently project the same carefully crafted image across his entire domain, reinforcing his message wherever he went. The most famous example of this is the Bayeux Tapestry. This stunning piece of embroidery is nearly 70 meters long, and it tells the story of the Norman conquest of England. But it does not tell the story as it happened. It tells the story as William the Conqueror wanted it to be remembered. The tapestry unfolds like a grand comic strip, portraying the English Earl Harold Godwinson as a treacherous oath-breaker who swore allegiance to William and then stole the crown for himself. William, in contrast, is shown as the pious and rightful heir, patiently building his invasion fleet after receiving divine blessing. The climax is the Battle of Hastings, depicted not as a savage conflict but as a triumphant, almost judicial, event where God's will is carried out. This was a masterclass in political spin, created to legitimize Norman rule to a conquered Anglo-Saxon population and to reassure allies on the continent. Its power came from its accessibility. A soldier who could not read a single word of Latin could look at these vivid scenes and understand the entire moral and political argument. He would see Harold depicted with averted eyes and weak posture, while William sat tall and resolute. The message was unmistakable, and it was absorbed by everyone from the highest noble to the lowliest servant in the hall. These woven chronicles transformed messy, complex historical events into clear, simple moral fables. They reinforced the social hierarchy by showing the ruler as brave, wise, and favored by heaven, while his enemies were shown as deceitful or cowardly. By making his version of events a tangible, beautiful, and ever-present part of the environment, a lord could ensure that his truth became the only truth. These textile masterpieces demonstrate that the most enduring propaganda is often both functional and magnificent, weaving together threads of fact and fiction to create a legend that could last for 1,000 years. But what happens when you want to make that legend permanent, when you want to carve it into the very landscape itself? A stone castle on a hill was more than a fortress. It was a permanent declaration of ownership carved directly into the earth itself. From its high walls, a lord could survey his lands, but more importantly, every peasant tilling the soil for miles around could also look up and see him. This constant, silent reminder was the essence of architectural propaganda. It communicated control without a single word being spoken. The sheer difficulty of building on such a prominent site was part of the message. It demonstrated a command of resources and labor so complete that the very mountains could be commanded to serve his will. A rival approaching such a stronghold would feel a psychological weight long before the first arrow was loosed. The castle was not just a place to live, it was a tool to dominate the horizon and the human mind. This same philosophy of overwhelming scale was used by the church, but for a different kind of conquest. Where the castle projected raw, earthly power, the Gothic cathedral reached for the heavens. To walk into Chartres or Notre Dame was to be transported. Sunlight, filtered through vast panels of stained glass, transformed the interior into a kaleidoscope of ruby, sapphire, and emerald. The stone ribs of the vault soared to impossible heights, making you feel infinitesimally small, yet connected to something divine. This was not an accident, it was a carefully engineered experience. The church was demonstrating its role as the sole gateway to God. The sheer cost of such a building, funded by the donations of thousands of faithful, was a testament to its immense wealth and social influence. Every aspect of the design encouraged piety and obedience. The sculptures on the portals told biblical stories to an illiterate populace. The rose windows symbolized the perfect order of God's universe, and the echoing space of the nave directed all attention toward the altar. This was persuasion through transcendence, making the authority of the Church feel as natural and eternal as the sky. The construction process itself was a powerful, ongoing spectacle. For decades, a town's central activity would be the raising of its cathedral. The quarrying of stone, the carving of figures, the forging of iron, and the labor of countless workers all served as a daily advertisement for the patron's power. A king or bishop who could command such a project for a generation was demonstrating a control over society that went far beyond the battlefield. He was shaping the environment itself. This power was then chiseled into the details. Above the main gate of a castle, you would find the Lord's coat of arms, a stone declaration of his family's noble lineage. Inside the cathedral, a statue of a saint, positioned to catch the morning light, offered a silent promise of protection and divine favor to those who supported the institution. These structures were not passive monuments. They were active participants in the social order, influencing every aspect of daily life from the moment a person was born in their shadow to the day they were buried in their cemetery. This physical manifestation of power, so grand and yet so fixed in place, created a need for a more flexible tool. If a king could not always be in his castle or cathedral, how could he ensure his image and authority traveled with him? A knight in full armor was an anonymous figure, a faceless warrior lost in a sea of steel. How could you tell friend from foe in the chaos of a charge, or recognize your lord when his helmet was closed? The solution to this practical problem evolved into one of the most sophisticated languages of power the world has ever seen. Heraldry began as simple colored patterns painted on shields, but it quickly blossomed into a complex symbolic system. A coat of arms was far more than a battlefield identification tag. It was a walking legal document, a public resume, and a declaration of divine right, all compressed into a single, vivid image. This visual shorthand could communicate a family's entire history, its alliances, and its claims to land and title, instantly understood by everyone from a fellow knight to a common foot soldier who could not read his own name. The symbols chosen were never arbitrary. A golden lion rampant on a red field screamed of courage and royal ambition. A soaring eagle evoked imperial power and a connection to ancient Rome. The delicate fleur-de-lis, famously adopted by the kings of France, was a direct claim to the blessing of the Virgin Mary herself. Every color, every animal, every arrangement carried a specific meaning, reinforcing the image the bearer wished to project to the world. This was not a free-for-all. The right to bear arms was tightly controlled by royal authority. A monarch could grant a coat of arms as the ultimate reward for loyalty and service, formally integrating a powerful family into the established feudal structure. This act of creation was a powerful political tool. By controlling these symbols, the crown could shape the visual landscape of the nobility, rewarding allies and visually reinforcing the hierarchy that kept them in power. The system's power made it a prime target for manipulation. In times of conflict and uncertain succession, a usurper would often adopt or subtly modify the coat of arms of the lineage he sought to replace. This was a bold propaganda move, an attempt to visually argue for his legitimacy before he ever won a battle. He was trying to hijack the symbolic authority of a bloodline and transfer it to himself. In response, the true heirs would parade their hereditary arms, using them to rally support and demonstrate an unbroken bloodline stretching back generations. Their very banner was their argument. This universal language painted on shields, flying from banners and pressed into wax seals, created a cohesive social order. It allowed for the immediate recognition of authority in a fragmented world. The power of a simple symbol to command such immediate loyalty and fear reveals how deeply this visual programming worked. But with so much depending on these symbols, a critical question emerged. How could anyone be sure that the coat of arms they saw was genuine and not a clever forgery designed to steal a crown? The answer to that question was pressed into a pool of warm wax. In a world of forgeries and distant commands, the royal seal was the ultimate guarantor of truth. It transformed a simple piece of parchment into an extension of the monarch's own voice, a physical piece of his authority that could travel hundreds of miles and still demand absolute obedience. The creation of a seal was a sacred act. Master engravers would carve a unique design into a small matrix, usually made from brass or even silver. This was not a task for an apprentice. The image had to be perfect, and more importantly, it had to be impossible to replicate. Common designs showed the king in his full majesty, seated on his throne with the scepter and orb of office. Another popular pose depicted him as a warrior, charging on his warhorse, a visual promise of his power to protect his realm and crush his enemies. Every time a document was presented, this image was the first thing a person saw, reinforcing the ruler's divine right and martial prowess before a single word was read aloud. The act of sealing was a public ritual. A scribe would finish the document, fold it, and pour a pool of hot wax onto a dangling strip of parchment or silk. Then the king or his chancellor would press the metal matrix into the soft wax with a firm, deliberate push. The resulting impression was a small, brittle piece of theater. The sound of the metal meeting the wax, the sight of the intricate design emerging, these sensory details made the authority feel present and real. To break this seal was not merely an act of disobedience. It was a symbolic attack on the person of the king himself, a crime punishable by severe penalties. This is why an intact seal guaranteed the authenticity of the message inside. A local sheriff receiving a sealed order to raise taxes did not need to recognize the handwriting or question the messenger. The unbroken seal was his proof. It was the word of his king, and he was bound to follow it. But these seals were more than just official stamps. They were miniature billboards for political campaigns. A king seeking to emphasize his piety might add a tiny figure of his patron saint standing beside his throne. A queen asserting her independent power might show herself holding a church, signaling her role as a defender of the faith. When a ruler conquered new territory, he would often update his seal, adding the heraldic symbols of his new lands to his own. This was a silent, legal claim, stamped onto every document he sent out, constantly reminding his new subjects and old rivals of his expanded dominion. This small disc of wax, often no larger than a coin, carried the immense weight of law, tradition, and psychological dominance. It was the key that unlocked the treasury, the command that mobilized armies, and the decree that could disinherit a noble family. Its power lay in its perfect fusion of art and administration, creating a symbol so potent that its simple presence could bend the will of thousands. This deep-seated trust in a tangible mark of truth reveals a fundamental aspect of the medieval mind, a reliance on the visual that artists would soon learn to manipulate on a breathtaking scale. A king's face was his most valuable political asset, carefully sculpted not from flesh but from pigment and gold. Royal portraiture was never about capturing a true likeness. It was about manufacturing an ideal, a charismatic vision of power that could persuade a populace and intimidate rivals. An artist commissioned to paint a monarch knew his task was not to flatter, but to translate abstract virtues into a visual form. He would follow a strict set of conventions, a code that every educated viewer understood. The king would be shown holding the sword of justice and the orb of the world, symbols of his temporal power to command and to judge. His posture would be rigid and frontal, his gaze direct and unwavering, communicating an authority that was both immediate and eternal. Any signs of human frailty, the wrinkles of age or the weaknesses of the body were simply edited out. The resulting image was not a man but an office. It was the idea of kingship made visible. This visual strategy was equally important for queens and empresses. While a king projected martial strength, a queen was often depicted in deep prayer, her hands clasped and her eyes lowered in devotion. This emphasized her role as a moral exemplar and intercessor, the pious heart of the kingdom who could appeal to God on behalf of her people. Her power was framed as spiritual and nurturing, a crucial counterbalance to her husband's earthly force. Together, these royal images created a complete package of governance, offering subjects both a protector and a saint. The true genius of this system was its distribution. The royal portrait was not locked away in a palace. It was stamped onto every coin in the kingdom. A peasant selling his chickens in the market would receive a silver penny bearing the stern, idealized profile of his sovereign. A merchant paying his taxes would hand over coins clinking with the king's face. This was constant, subtle, and inescapable conditioning. With every financial transaction, the image of authority was physically handled. Its value literally transferred into the hands of every subject, from the wealthiest lord to the poorest serf. This daily reminder made the ruler's presence feel ubiquitous, a part of the very fabric of economic life. In times of political crisis, this battle of images intensified. A rival claimant to a throne would immediately commission his own portraits and have his own coins minted. This was a direct visual challenge. By flooding the market with his own face, he was not just asserting a claim. He was attempting to overwrite the existing reality, to make his own likeness the new symbol of power and stability. People holding a new coin with a new face were being psychologically prepared for a new regime. The art of the royal portrait was therefore a primary tool of statecraft. It created a stable, recognizable figurehead around which loyalty could coalesce. It transformed a fallible human being into a symbol of permanence and order. A well-managed image could quell dissent, secure alliances, and legitimize a dubious bloodline, proving that a charismatic likeness could indeed be worth more than 1,000 soldiers. But these static portraits were only one part of the story. To truly secure a legacy, a ruler needed to control not just how he looked, but the very narrative of his life and reign. A king kneeling in prayer within a stained glass window was never just a king. He was a carefully placed argument in a divine debate. Throughout the Middle Ages, the most powerful rulers understood that to control a kingdom, they first had to appear in its chapels. They embedded their portraits and coats of arms directly into the sacred art of the church, transforming spaces of worship into theaters of political legitimacy. This was the masterstroke of medieval propaganda, a fusion of faith and power so complete that to question one was to blaspheme against the other. Look at any great altarpiece from this period, and you will often find the wealthy donor kneeling humbly in the corner of a holy scene. A duke might be painted right beside the Virgin Mary, or a queen might be shown receiving a blessing from a saint. This was not a simple act of piety. It was a visual contract linking the ruler's earthly authority directly to divine approval. The message to any noble or peasant gazing upon this art was unmistakable. To rebel against this duke or this queen was not merely an act of treason. It was a sin against God himself. This association created a psychological barrier to dissent far stronger than any castle wall. The weaponization of religious art was not one-sided. During the Great Investiture controversy, a bitter power struggle between popes and emperors over who could appoint bishops. Both sides launched a war of images. Supporters of the Pope produced manuscripts and frescoes showing the Holy Roman Emperor as a power-mad tyrant, trampling the cross under his horse's hooves. In response, imperial artists depicted the Pope as a false prophet, a corrupt heretic leading the faithful astray. Each side used the visual language of faith to frame the other as not just a political opponent, but an enemy of God. This tactic made compromise nearly impossible, turning a dispute over appointments into a holy war for the soul of Christendom. The ultimate expression of this strategy was the cult of royal saints. Kings like Edward the Confessor in England and Louis IX in France were officially canonized, their lives held up as models of perfect Christian kingship. For the living monarchs who followed them, this was a priceless inheritance. By emphasizing their bloodline or their namesake connection to a saint king, a ruler could bask in reflected holiness. He could present himself as the spiritual heir to a divine legacy, his every policy and command carrying the weight of his sainted predecessor. This blurred the line between the palace and the pulpit until they were virtually indistinguishable. The result was an environment where political authority was constantly sanctified. Every time a villager attended Mass, their eyes would fall upon the stained glass window donated by their Lord, his face illuminated by the same light that shone on the apostles. Every prayer offered in that space, whether for a good harvest or for the soul of a departed loved one, subtly reinforced the legitimacy of the ruling family simply by occurring in their visual shadow. The Church became an unwitting partner in this propaganda, its sacred walls providing the perfect canvas for a message of unchallengeable, God-given power. This deep entanglement of spiritual belief and political control created a narrative so overwhelming that few could even conceive of an alternative. To understand just how potent this visual alliance could be, we need to witness it in action during one of history's most decisive confrontations. The Bayeux Tapestry transforms a brutal invasion into a divine courtroom drama. Its 70-meter-long narrative is not a neutral record, but a brilliant legal brief stitched in wool, designed to prove that William of Normandy was not a foreign aggressor but the rightful King of England. The entire justification for the conquest hinges on one pivotal scene. Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon Earl, is shown with his hands placed on two reliquaries, swearing a sacred oath of allegiance to William. The tapestry presents this moment not as a simple promise, but as a binding contract sworn on the holiest objects imaginable. When Harold later takes the English crown for himself, his act is framed not as a political maneuver, but as a catastrophic act of perjury. He broke a vow made to God, and William's subsequent invasion becomes a holy mission to punish a sacred oath-breaker and restore God's intended order. This was the core of the Norman argument, a story so compelling it would resonate for centuries. The character assassination continues in the visual details. Harold is consistently depicted with a weak posture and a shifty gaze, his motives made to seem treacherous. William, in stark contrast, is portrayed as the model of pious and deliberate kingship. He is shown consulting his wise men, praying before the battle, and leading his troops with calm authority. The climax of this moral tale is Harold's death. The famous panel shows a figure, widely believed to be Harold, struck in the eye by an arrow. For a medieval audience, this was not a random battle injury. It was a clear sign of divine judgment, a punishment fit for a man who had looked upon a crown that was not rightfully his. The symbolism was unmistakable and terrifying. The tapestry's propaganda extends beyond the battlefield to a contrast of cultures. In the aftermath of the victory, the Normans are shown constructing a sturdy motte and bailey castle, a symbol of the order and civilization they were bringing to a chaotic land. Another scene depicts them seated at a long table, feasting in an organized, almost ceremonial manner. The defeated Anglo-Saxons, by comparison, are often shown in disarray. This visual rhetoric argued that the Normans were not just conquerors but civilizers. They were replacing chaos with structure, and their rule was a benefit to England. Commissioned by William's own half-brother, Bishop Odo, the tapestry was a monumental piece of political theatre. It was likely displayed in the Great Hall of his castle or even in a church, where its vivid, sequential panels could be walked along and understood by everyone, regardless of their literacy. Its story was absorbed collectively, becoming the accepted truth through sheer repetition and visual power. The ultimate testament to its success is that for nearly 1,000 years, its version of events, of the oath and the perjured king, has dominated our understanding of the Norman conquest. It stands as a permanent monument to the idea that the most enduring victories are not just won on the battlefield, but are carefully woven into the public imagination. The Capetian kings of France turned their bloodline into a sacred institution. They wove a powerful myth of divine right, a political doctrine claiming their power flowed not from the people but directly from God. This was not a simple claim. It was a multi-generational propaganda project, meticulously crafted across parchments, paintings, and public ceremonies. At its heart was a strategic veneration of Saint Louis, King Louis IX. This saint king, renowned for his justice and piety, became the dynasty's ultimate public relations tool. By constantly linking themselves to his holy legacy, the Capetians argued that God had blessed their family line above all others. They were not merely rulers. They were a chosen people ordained to lead France. This spiritual pedigree was carefully recorded in manuscripts like the Grands Chroniques de France. These lavish histories were not objective accounts. They were dynastic advertisements depicting the Capetian succession as a continuous, miraculous chain, with each king receiving a divine mandate from his predecessor. The messy realities of politics and power were erased, replaced by a smooth, heavenly narrative that made their rule seem as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons. How do you prove a king is touched by God? The Capetians had a physical answer. They popularized the royal touch, a ceremony where the king would lay his hands on subjects suffering from scrofula, a disfiguring illness. The act was believed to produce miraculous cures. This was more than a medical practice. It was live-action propaganda, a public spectacle that transformed the king's physical body into a living relic. His very flesh became a conduit for divine power. Art played a crucial role in broadcasting these miracles. Paintings and tapestries showed long lines of the afflicted waiting for the king's healing touch, their faith rewarded. These images reinforced the message daily. The king was not just a political leader, he was a thaumaturge, a miracle worker, and to oppose him was to oppose the will of God himself. This long-term campaign had a profound political effect. It systematically dismantled the power of the French nobility. The Capetians had begun as elected officials, their authority theoretically granted by the great lords. But over centuries of consistent messaging, they transformed their position. They became hereditary monarchs whose right to rule was considered eternal and unchallengeable. Aristocratic opposition did not just become treasonous, it became sacrilegious, a futile struggle against a divine plan. The Capetian propaganda machine, with its blend of art, ritual, and history, created a template for royal legitimacy that would be copied across Europe. It proved that power, when sanctified by a beautiful and persistent story, could become absolute. This fusion of spiritual and earthly authority was a masterpiece of medieval public relations, a lesson the Church itself had long understood. The papal throne understood the power of images with a clarity that would impress any modern advertiser. While kings fought for earthly crowns, the popes in Rome were building a visual empire designed to last for eternity. Their medium was the church wall itself, transformed into a canvas of divine authority. Inside the papal palaces and great basilicas, artists painted vast fresco cycles that told a very specific version of history. One of the most potent was the story of the donation of Constantine. This was a document, later proven to be an 8th century forgery, that claimed the Roman Emperor Constantine had granted the Pope political control over all of Western Europe. The Church treated this fabrication as absolute fact, and artists were commissioned to depict the scene on walls across Christendom. For a pilgrim who could not read the Latin text, the painting was the truth. He would see the great emperor humbly kneeling, offering worldly power to the vicar of Christ. This image, repeated again and again, became the foundational argument for the Pope's right to command kings. It was history written not with pen and ink, but with pigment and plaster. This visual declaration of supremacy was made even more explicit in papal portraiture. Official portraits often showed a pontiff not in prayer, but in a posture of domination. He would be depicted with his foot resting firmly on the neck of a prostrate figure, symbolizing a conquered emperor or a crushed heresy. The message was brutal in its simplicity. The spiritual sword was superior to the temporal one. The Church ruled over all earthly powers, and to challenge this order was to rebel against God himself. These were not subtle statements. They were theological arguments rendered in a language everyone could understand, a constant visual reminder that the ultimate authority in any medieval conflict resided in Rome. To house these powerful images, the papacy constructed monuments of staggering scale. The building of St. Peter's Basilica was the ultimate architectural propaganda. Its immense dome, visible for miles, was a physical manifestation of the Church's wealth, and its claim to be the sole gateway to heaven. Pilgrims who traveled to Rome would walk through its towering doors and be overwhelmed. The sheer size of the space, the glitter of the gold leaf, the play of light through stained glass, every sensory detail was engineered to inspire awe and, consequently, obedience. This was a power that could literally move mountains of stone, convincing the faithful that an institution capable of such a wonder must indeed hold the keys to salvation. Even the documents that flowed from the papal chancery were designed to command immediate respect. Papal bulls, the most formal type of decree, were instantly recognizable. They were written on the finest parchment and illuminated with intricate borders featuring the crossed keys of St. Peter and the triple-tiered papal tiara. These symbols were the corporate logo of the medieval Church, and their presence on a document communicated its divine origin and binding authority before a single word was read. To receive such a bull was to hold a piece of papal power in your hands. During the bitter investiture controversy, this battle of images became a war for the soul of Europe. Competing popes and anti-popes each commissioned their own artworks, turning churches into competing galleries of legitimacy. Supporters of the Reformed Pope Gregory VII produced images portraying the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV as a tyrant excommunicated by the Church. In response, imperial artists depicted Gregory as a power-hungry usurper. This was a propaganda duel fought with paint and mosaic, each side desperate to win the hearts of the nobility and the common people. The side that told the more compelling visual story often gained the crucial upper hand, proving that in the medieval world, a well-placed image could be as decisive as a well-armed knight. Through this sophisticated and relentless campaign, the papacy crafted a perception of unchallengeable authority that permeated every level of society. From the illiterate farmer gazing at a fresco to the emperor reading a sealed bull, the message was unified and overwhelming. The Church's genius lay in making its political and territorial ambitions look like the natural, God-given order of the universe. This mastery of perception allowed a spiritual institution to wield profound secular influence for centuries, shaping the destiny of nations from the walls of its own magnificent buildings. A monastery's scriptorium was the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a printing press, and its ink was often mixed with bias. Monastic chronicles, the year-by-year histories of kingdoms, were presented as objective truth, but they were deeply political documents. The monks who wrote them depended entirely on the protection and funding of powerful patrons. A king who donated vast tracts of land to an abbey could expect a very favorable portrayal in its chronicles. His military campaigns were not recorded as brutal land grabs but as righteous crusades. His political opponents were not ambitious nobles but treacherous villains who threatened God's ordained order. This was history written not as it happened, but as the victor needed it to be remembered. The chronicle was a tool to transform a ruler's temporary power into a permanent and glorious legacy, etched onto the pages of time itself. Consider the example of a rebellious baron challenging a Plantagenet king. In the official monastic record, this baron would not be a man fighting for his rights. He would be an oath-breaker, a traitor whose actions threatened the peace of the entire realm. The chronicler would use language with surgical precision, describing the king's allies as gallant and devout, while labeling his enemies as tyrannical or even heretical. This moral framing justified the king's subsequent reprisals. The confiscation of the baron's lands and the execution of his followers were not acts of political vengeance. They were presented as the necessary restoration of divine order, a lesson for anyone else who might dare to challenge God's anointed ruler. The physical beauty of these chronicles amplified their authority. Lavishly illustrated with miniatures showing the king in prayer or triumphantly leading his armies, they were works of art as much as history. These books were not left to gather dust on a single shelf. They were copied meticulously by hand and distributed to other monasteries across the kingdom and beyond. This network of scriptoriums acted as a medieval internet, spreading a curated, pro-establishment narrative among the educated elite who advised rulers and shaped policy. A bishop in a distant diocese reading such a chronicle would absorb its perspective and likely reinforce it in his own sermons and letters. This created an echo chamber of power, where the king's version of events became the only version widely available. The result was a profound manipulation of memory. Future generations, looking back at these beautifully crafted pages, would accept their account as the definitive story. A messy civil war became a simple tale of good versus evil. A contested succession was smoothed into a seamless, divinely willed transition. By controlling the past, the monastic chroniclers gave their patrons an unassailable grip on the present. The written word, trusted as a vessel of truth, was weaponized to serve power, proving that the most enduring conquest is the conquest of history itself. This careful curation of narrative through text finds its perfect parallel in the deliberate manipulation of physical space, where entire landscapes were redesigned to tell a story of dominance. The light inside a Gothic cathedral was not ordinary light. It was a substance transformed, pouring through walls of colored glass to paint the air in deep blues, ruby reds, and emerald greens. For the medieval worshipper, this was a direct glimpse of heaven's glory, an experience carefully engineered by the church and its patrons. These towering stained glass windows were far more than decoration. They were massive, luminous storybooks designed for a population that could not read. A single window could depict the entire life of a saint or a complex parable from the Old Testament, turning biblical narrative into a visual spectacle that was both beautiful and instructive. But woven into these holy scenes was a second, more earthly message. Look closely at the bottom edge of a magnificent window, and you would often find a small, kneeling figure. This was the donor portrait, a permanent advertisement for the king, queen, or bishop who paid for this piece of heaven. By placing their own image at the base of a sacred story, bathed in the same divine light that illuminated Christ and the apostles, these powerful patrons created an unbreakable visual link. Their generosity, and by extension their authority, was sanctified. To question their rule was not just disloyal, it was to stand against the very light of God shining through the glass. This association was reinforced by the specific stories chosen for the windows. A king facing internal rebellion might fund a window showing the Old Testament King David, the righteous and godly ruler, triumphing over his treacherous enemies. The parallel was unmistakable. The current monarch was the new David, his struggles were biblical, and his victory was divinely assured. The colors themselves spoke a silent language of power. The most expensive pigments, like the vibrant blue made from crushed lapis lazuli imported from distant Afghanistan, were reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary and for the backgrounds of royal figures. Gold leaf, applied between pieces of glass, made halos and heavenly scenes shimmer with a light that seemed to come from within. When this brilliant gold was used in a panel depicting a living king, it created a powerful symbolic connection. The celestial hierarchy of heaven, with God and his angels at the top, was mirrored by the earthly hierarchy, with the anointed king at its apex. The message was that the social order was not a human invention, but a reflection of a divine plan. The true genius of stained glass propaganda was its immersive and participatory nature. A peasant attending Mass did not simply see a political message on a wall. They were enveloped by it. As the sun moved across the sky, the colored light would shift and change, making the scenes appear to come alive. The entire space of the church was transformed into a kaleidoscope of faith and loyalty. During the liturgy, as the priest's voice echoed under the vaulted ceilings, the worshippers' eyes would naturally rise to these radiant stories. The visual lesson was absorbed subconsciously, week after week, year after year. The authority of the patron became as natural and unquestionable as the light itself. This was persuasion through transcendence, an environmental engineering of belief that made the political feel spiritual. It embedded a deep, emotional loyalty that parchment decrees and royal seals could only command from a distance. If stained glass could make a king's power feel like a divine force, then the rituals performed in that same sacred space could make it a tangible, physical reality. A pilgrimage was a map of faith drawn across the landscape itself, but this sacred geography was never neutral territory. Kings and bishops learned to redraw these spiritual maps, channeling the immense energy of popular devotion into a powerful current that reinforced their own authority. They understood that by controlling where people traveled, they could control the stories they believed. A well-managed pilgrimage route became a river of wealth, influence, and political justification, flowing directly into the coffers and cathedrals of its patrons. The most famous example is the Way of St. James, leading to the shrine of Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. During the long Reconquista, the Christian kingdoms of Iberia heavily promoted this pilgrimage. They built bridges, hospices, and entire cities along the path, framing the journey not just as an act of personal penance, but as a collective crusade. A pilgrim walking to Santiago was, in effect, walking into reclaimed territory. their very footsteps helping to consolidate Christian control over lands recently taken from Muslim rulers. Royal patronage along the route was a masterful piece of political theater. A king who funded a new monastery or a fortified church for pilgrims was publicly performing his piety while simultaneously building a network of alliances and showcasing his wealth and power to every traveler who passed through. His name and coat of arms were carved into the stone of the very buildings that offered these weary souls shelter, ensuring his generosity was remembered and praised all across Europe. The propaganda did not end when the pilgrimage was over. Pilgrims would purchase small, mass-produced tokens made of lead or tin, known as pilgrim badges. These were cheap enough for almost anyone to afford, and they were designed to be sewn onto a hat or a cloak. A badge from Compostela depicting the iconic scallop shell was a wearable advertisement. It told everyone in a pilgrim's home village that they had completed this prestigious journey, that they had witnessed the power of the shrine, and by extension, the legitimacy of the kings and bishops who controlled it. These humble tokens turned returning pilgrims into mobile billboards for a specific political and religious agenda. The ultimate source of a shrine's power, however, was its relics. Controlling access to the physical remains of a saint or a piece of the true cross gave an authority figure an unparalleled platform. In grand ceremonies, a bishop would display a sacred relic to a crowd of thousands, then claim to perform miracles of healing in its name. This was not just a spiritual act, it was a visual proof of concept. The church, by housing this object, held a special hotline to heaven, and its blessings or its curses were terrifyingly real. This power to perform miracles on demand made the institution's authority seem both divine and indispensable. This led to intense competition. Rival cities or monasteries often claimed to possess the same relic, such as the several churches across Europe that each insisted they held the genuine head of John the Baptist. These claims were never purely theological debates. They were political rivalries fought with art and architecture. Each side would build a more magnificent chapel, commission a more lifelike reliquary of gold and gems, and produce illuminated manuscripts detailing the miraculous journey of their specific relic to its current home. They were using aesthetics as evidence, arguing that the sheer beauty and grandeur surrounding their object was proof enough of its authenticity. When a believer embarked on a pilgrimage, they were not just seeking forgiveness. They were physically enacting a story written by those in power. They walked a path that reinforced territorial claims. They venerated relics that validated specific authorities, and they returned home wearing the symbols of that legitimacy. This mobilization of faith turned millions of ordinary people into active, willing participants in their own persuasion, their journeys weaving the threads of propaganda directly into the fabric of their daily lives. The success of this spiritual campaign, however, depended entirely on the skill of the artisans who gave these abstract ideas a beautiful and tangible form. The master painter who gilded a king's portrait remained nameless by design. His identity was submerged so that the image of power could appear unchallengeable and divine. These illuminators, sculptors, and weavers were not hailed as creative geniuses. They were highly skilled craftsmen, hired to execute the precise vision of a bishop, a baron, or a king. Their workshops operated under intense supervision, bound by centuries of iconographic tradition that dictated everything from the color of a saint's robe to the angle of a monarch's gaze. An artist did not choose to paint a king larger than his courtiers because it looked dramatic. He did so because the patron demanded a visual representation of the feudal hierarchy, a composition where authority was literally measured in scale. The brilliance of these anonymous hands lay in their ability to translate abstract political needs into visceral emotional experiences. They knew how to use lapis lazuli blue to evoke the majesty of the Virgin Mary, or how to carve the snarling demons on a church portal to provoke a very real fear of hellfire. Their technical mastery was a tool carefully harnessed to guide public sentiment toward awe, obedience, and reverence. This required a universal visual language. Through repetition, artists developed a powerful shorthand that even an illiterate farmer could decipher in an instant. A golden halo signaled sanctity. A specific shade of purple made from rare and costly dyes was reserved for royalty alone. A lion symbolized courage, while a twisted, grotesque figure in a manuscript margin represented heresy or sin. These were not subtle codes, they were blunt instruments of communication, making complex theological and political arguments instantly understandable across every social class. This system of control was not always absolute. If you look closely enough at the stone carvings in a remote cathedral or in the crowded margins of a prayer book, you can sometimes find a subtle act of rebellion. A mischievous gargoyle might bear the likeness of a hated tax collector. A monk, painstakingly illustrating a sacred text, might hide a tiny, humorous scene of everyday life among the solemn figures. These were quiet, dangerous gestures, a way for the artist to reclaim a sliver of personal expression. But such deviations were incredibly rare. The primary function of their art was to serve power, and their anonymity was the final, crucial ingredient in the illusion. When a subject knelt before a stained glass window, they saw the word of God and the face of their king, not the hand of the glassmaker who soldered the lead. The propaganda felt like a natural force, an organic expression of a divine order, because its human architects had been so completely erased. To recognize this deliberate anonymity is to gain a new key for decoding the medieval world. It allows us to look past the overwhelming beauty and ask a more critical question: whose voice is really speaking through this art? By separating the craftsman's skill from the patron's intention, we begin to see the blueprint for how public perception was engineered, a collaborative process between wealth and talent that would forever shape the art of persuasion. A king's seal could be broken and his sacred imagery could be turned against him. For every grand tapestry celebrating divine right, there existed a humble badge of protest. The medieval public sphere was not a one-way street of authority. It was a contested arena where peasants, heretics, and rebellious nobles fought back with their own symbols, creating a hidden world of counter-propaganda that challenged the very foundations of power. When peasants rose in revolt, as they did across Europe from England to Flanders, they did not march without banners. They adopted their own. The rebels of the English Peasants' Revolt in 1381 flew a flag bearing the image of a man and a woman tilling the soil. This was a direct subversion of heraldry, where a noble coat of arms celebrated individual lineage and martial glory. The peasant banner represented communal labor and the dignity of the common people who fed the entire kingdom. Their symbols were not about divine right, but about human rights, a powerful visual argument for justice that turned the language of the elite against them. Other movements chose more secretive forms of resistance. The Cathars, a heretical sect in southern France, developed a complete alternative to the Catholic Church. They produced their own religious texts and trained their own ministers, creating a parallel spiritual world that openly criticized church wealth and corruption. Their propaganda was so effective that the Pope launched the Albigensian Crusade to wipe them out. The Inquisition systematically hunted down and burned every Cathar book and image they could find. This wholesale destruction is precisely why so little of this rebel art survives today. the authorities understood that to win a war of ideas, you must erase the enemy's voice completely. Yet even in the heart of the establishment, quiet acts of rebellion flourished. In the margins of the very illuminated manuscripts that glorified kings, bored or disgruntled monks would sometimes sketch satirical scenes. A fox dressed in a bishop's robes might preach to a flock of geese. A knight, supposedly the peak of chivalry, could be shown fleeing from a rabbit. These doodles were more than just jokes. They were a subtle but dangerous critique of clerical hypocrisy and noble cowardice, a whispered dissent hidden in the sacred text itself. For the nobility, rebellion required a different kind of symbol, one that matched the legitimacy of the crown. When the English barons rose against King John, they did not simply raise an army. They created their own government and issued their own charters, sealed with their own collective seal. The most famous of these documents was the Magna Carta. This was not a chaotic demand. It was a carefully crafted legal and propaganda tool, presented as a defense of ancient tradition against a tyrant. By using the formal language and seals of authority, the barons legitimized their rebellion, framing it not as treason, but as a necessary restoration of good governance. This symbolic warfare proved that the tools of power were not exclusive to the powerful. A simple pilgrim badge could be repurposed to identify a heretic. A popular ballad sung in a tavern could spread news of a baron's injustice faster than any royal messenger. Every act of counter-propaganda, from a marginal doodle to a rebel charter, carried immense risk. Artists caught mocking their patrons could lose their hands, heretics faced execution, rebel lords were hanged and their lands seized, but the fact that these acts persisted reveals a crucial truth. The medieval mind was not blindly obedient. People could decode the symbols of authority, and they could create their own. This constant push and pull of persuasion and resistance created a rich and dynamic visual culture, a silent dialogue between the castle on the hill and the voices in the valley below. A king's propaganda began not with a brushstroke, but with a tax collector. The grandest cathedrals and most intricate tapestries were funded by the very people whose loyalty they were designed to secure. This was the Economics of Persuasion, a system where public wealth was transformed into private monuments of power. Every stone laid in a royal castle, every pane of stained glass in a bishop's chapel, represented a strategic diversion of resources, a clear statement that shaping minds was as critical as filling granaries. The ruling class understood that perception was a currency, and they were willing to spend vast sums to control its mint. Consider the sheer cost of an illuminated manuscript. The vibrant blue in a biblical scene came from lapis lazuli, a gemstone mined in a single remote region of Afghanistan and transported across continents by a chain of merchants. Its price, weight for weight, often rivaled gold. The gold leaf itself, meticulously hammered into sheets thinner than a human hair, represented a fortune melted onto the page. A single gospel book could consume the annual income of a sizable estate. Its creation, a multi-year project requiring a team of scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders. This was not merely a book. It was a treasury you could hold in your hands, a deliberate and breathtaking display of wealth that argued for the patron's divine favor through the sheer force of their finances. Noble families pursued a different kind of spiritual investment. They endowed monasteries with vast tracts of fertile land and chests of silver, a transaction that secured more than just prayers for their souls. In return, they expected the monastic chroniclers to record their lineage in the most flattering light. A baron's brutal suppression of a peasant revolt would be reframed as a righteous act of justice. His dubious claim to a neighbor's land would be presented as a sacred duty. This was a long-term investment in legacy. paying scribes to ensure that future generations would read a version of history where their family were the heroes, not the oppressors. The monastery's scriptorium became a public relations firm, its ink paid for by the subjects of its flattery. The most ambitious projects required the wealth of an entire kingdom. A grand tapestry, like the one celebrating the Norman conquest, was a colossal financial undertaking. A workshop of master weavers and their apprentices would labor for years, their looms consuming mountains of dyed wool and silk thread. The patron, William the Conqueror's half-brother Odo, funded this 70-meter-long masterpiece not out of a love for art, but as an essential cost of consolidating his power. It was a capital investment in shaping historical memory, a visual argument so expensive that its very existence was proof of the legitimacy it proclaimed. The money spent on those woven scenes could have built a new town or fortified a border, but the ruler calculated that winning the narrative war was more valuable. This allocation of resources reveals the stark priorities of the medieval elite. While a village might petition their lord for funds to repair a crumbling bridge or a flooded mill, the same lord would readily pour a fortune into a new set of tapestries for his hall or a stained glass window for the local abbey bearing his coat of arms. These choices were not frivolous, they were calculated acts of statecraft. A beautiful, intimidating castle deterred invasion more effectively than a larger army that consumed food and pay. A reputation for piety and power broadcast through art could prevent rebellions before they ever started. Controlling perception was the cheapest way to control a kingdom. The economic reality behind the art proves that medieval propaganda was never a side project. It was a central pillar of governance, a necessary expense to make power feel inevitable, beautiful, and eternal. The power of a symbol carved in stone 1,000 years ago still echoes in the steel and glass of our modern capitals. The psychological battlefield of the Middle Ages did not vanish with the advent of the printing press. It simply evolved, its ancient strategies repurposed for new media. The same principles that convinced a medieval peasant of a king's divine right are now used to shape our perceptions of politicians, products, and national identity. Our world is saturated with these updated versions of parchment and paint, and recognizing their lineage is the first step toward understanding how persuasion truly works. Modern political campaigns are a direct heir to medieval heraldry. Think of the bold colors chosen for a candidate's branding. A deep, patriotic blue is not so different from the azure field on a noble's coat of arms, both promising stability and trust. A vibrant, energetic red echoes the gules of a knight's shield, signaling action and strength. Campaign logos function as modern coats of arms, designed for instant recognition and to convey a set of values without a single word. The idealized portrait, too, has been perfected. Just as a medieval artist erased a king's flaws, today's digital retouching and carefully staged photography present a leader who is perpetually vigorous, compassionate, and in command. The goal remains identical: to transform a fallible human into an unimpeachable symbol. Look at the architecture of power in any major city. Supreme courts and parliamentary buildings often rise with the same imposing grandeur as Gothic cathedrals, their facades adorned with columns and statues that borrow directly from classical and medieval traditions. These structures are not merely offices, they are deliberate statements of permanence and legitimacy, using stone and scale to inspire the same awe that a feudal castle once did. They tell us that the institutions within are as enduring as the mountains, their authority rooted in deep history. Even the humble corporate logo finds its origin in the royal seal. That embossed mark on your credit card or the distinctive icon on a government form serves the same purpose as a monarch's sigil in wax. It is a tiny, powerful stamp of authenticity, a promise that the entity behind it is real and its commands are to be trusted. The most pervasive legacy, however, lies in the art of narrative control. The medieval chronicler who turned a bloody invasion into a holy crusade has his counterpart in the modern spin doctor. The Bayeux Tapestry's simplified, moralistic version of the Norman conquest is echoed in today's political advertisements and social media campaigns that reduce complex global events into clean, emotionally charged stories of heroes and villains. This age-old practice of shaping reality to fit a preferred outcome demonstrates that human psychology has changed very little. We are still drawn to clear narratives that confirm our biases and affirm our tribe. Understanding this long history of visual persuasion changes how we see the world. It makes us more critical, more visually literate. When we see a politician positioned before a national flag, we can recognize the ghost of a king standing before his heraldic banner. When we walk through a grand government plaza, we can feel the subtle intimidation of the castle on the hill. This knowledge does not make us cynical. It makes us empowered. It allows us to separate the message from the manipulation, to see the ancient threads of influence woven into the fabric of our modern life. The next time you encounter a powerful image, ask yourself not just what it shows, but what it is trying to build and what reality it seeks to make you accept. Gold leaf did more than decorate a page. It offered a tangible piece of heaven to a world gripped by earthly fears. In an age of plague, famine, and constant violence, the human mind craved order and divine reassurance above all else. Medieval propagandists were masters of this psychological landscape. They did not just present a king, they presented a shield against chaos, a figure who could stand between a vulnerable population and the terrors of a brutal world. An image of a saintly monarch or a protective virgin in a stained glass window was not mere art. It was a psychological anchor, providing a visual promise of stability in a life defined by uncertainty. This appeal to deep-seated emotional needs made their messages far more powerful than any logical argument could ever be. The very materials they used were chosen for their psychological impact. The radiant shimmer of gold leaf in a manuscript was not just a display of wealth. For the medieval viewer, it was a direct visual echo of the streets of heaven, a substance that transcended the mundane dirt of daily life. Vivid blues from lapis lazuli and rich crimson dyes were not simply colors. They were sensory triggers, deliberately used to evoke feelings of sacred majesty and divine royalty. When a person saw their ruler depicted in these heavenly hues, surrounded by gold, the political message was absorbed at a subconscious level. His authority felt less like a human invention and more like a natural extension of the celestial order. This system relied on constant, repetitive exposure to forge unbreakable mental links. A peasant might see the cross a dozen times before midday, from the church spire to the prayer book. He would handle a coin stamped with the king's face and the fleur-de-lis every time he bought bread. He would hear sermons illustrated by the very same tapestries hanging in his lord's hall. This relentless repetition wired his brain to associate these specific symbols with safety, community, and God's favor. The cross meant salvation. The king's face on the coin meant stability and law. These symbols became cognitive shortcuts, bypassing reason to trigger instantaneous feelings of loyalty, reverence, or even fear. The most potent psychological trick was the seamless fusion of the spiritual and the political. By embedding a king's portrait into a biblical scene, or showing a saint handing a sword to an emperor, propagandists made an earthly power claim feel like a divine commandment. To question the king was not just disloyal, It was to doubt the entire structure of salvation, to risk your immortal soul. This merger made political opposition psychologically terrifying. How could a mere mortal argue against an order that was painted as being authored by God Himself? For the vast majority who could not read, these visual narratives were their entire reality. A complex issue like a royal succession or a legal dispute was translated into a simple, emotional story in a tapestry or a stained glass window. You did not need to understand the laws of inheritance to grasp the image of a treacherous earl struck in the eye by God's judgment. The emotional truth of the picture, its clear morality tale of good and evil, was far more compelling and memorable than any dry legal text. This direct pathway to the heart is what made medieval propaganda so resilient. It was not built on facts that could be debated, but on faith that could not be challenged. Its power was rooted in the universal human longing for meaning, security, and connection to something greater than oneself. Recognizing these ancient psychological levers helps us see why a beautifully told story, then and now, can so easily become the truth. A queen's power often flowed through the quiet channels of patronage. While kings projected martial strength, medieval women in positions of influence mastered a different kind of persuasion, using art to navigate the rigid structures of a patriarchal world and carve out spaces of genuine authority. Queens and noblewomen became adept commissioners, funding projects that carefully framed their power within accepted virtues, turning potential weaknesses into formidable strengths. Helena of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, understood this perfectly. As Queen of both France and later England, her patronage of literature and the arts crafted an image of a sophisticated, cultured ruler. She transformed her court into a center of troubadour poetry and chivalric ideals, influencing the very codes of behavior that governed the nobility. This was not mere entertainment. It was a soft power strategy that extended her influence far beyond the battlefield, making her a central figure in the cultural and political life of Europe. Her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, employed a more direct visual strategy, serving as regent for her young son, King Louis IX of France. Blanche faced constant challenges from rebellious barons who questioned a woman's right to rule. Her response was a brilliant propaganda campaign built on imagery of maternal devotion and pious regency. She commissioned illuminated manuscripts and founded religious houses that depicted her as the wise and protective mother of both her son and the kingdom itself. In one famous psalter, she is shown instructing the young Louis, visually arguing that her rule was an extension of her sacred duty as a parent. By wrapping her authority in the familiar and unchallengeable cloak of motherhood, Blanche legitimized her unprecedented political power and secured the Capetian dynasty's future. Beyond queens, female saints provided a powerful template for idealized behavior, their lives and images serving as tools for social control. The church and state heavily promoted the cults of saints like Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch. Their stories, vividly depicted in stained glass and sculpture, emphasized virtues like unwavering faith, heroic chastity, and ultimate martyrdom. For women, these images presented a clear, if narrow, path to spiritual prestige. They modeled a form of power through piety and sacrifice, encouraging behaviors that maintained the social order. Yet, for the women who venerated them, these saints also represented figures of immense personal strength and divine favor, offering a complex model of female agency within a constrained system. On a more practical level, noblewomen asserted their independence through the symbols of daily administration. A lady's personal seal was a potent declaration of her legal and economic identity. Often, these seals displayed her own heraldic arms alongside her husband's, or sometimes her own image engaged in an act of authority, such as holding a charter. When she sealed a document, she was not just a consort, she was a party to a contract, a landowner, or a ruler in her own right. This small disc of wax was her signature and her guarantee, a public claim to a voice in the feudal world. It proved that women were active participants in the economy of power, using the same tools as men to protect their interests and administer their estates. Perhaps the most dramatic example of a woman becoming the subject of propaganda is Joan of Arc. Her incredible story was instantly weaponized by all sides. To the French loyalists, she was the divinely inspired maid sent by God to rescue the kingdom, her image crafted to emphasize her piety, her virginity, and her miraculous military guidance. After her capture, her English opponents and their Burgundian allies systematically worked to destroy that image. They orchestrated her trial for heresy, attempting to recast her as a witch, a blasphemer, and a cross-dressing aberration. They sought to dismantle her symbolic power by attacking her very identity, proving how dangerous a woman who successfully harnessed the visual language of authority could be to the established order. The representations of medieval women in art and symbolism reveal the nuanced reality of propaganda. It was a system that certainly reinforced traditional gender hierarchies, yet it also provided clever women with a vocabulary to assert themselves, protect their domains, and shape their legacies. They used the language of feminine virtue not just to conform, but to command, demonstrating that the art of persuasion was never exclusively a man's game. A king's propaganda could shatter against the hard stone of lived experience. For all its sophistication, the medieval art of persuasion had clear limits, and its failures are just as revealing as its triumphs. The most elaborate tapestry or the most flattering chronicle was powerless in the face of a ruler's profound incompetence or cruelty. King John of England is the classic example. His royal seals commanded armies, and his charters were written on the finest parchment, but no amount of symbolic authority could salvage his reputation. The English barons and common people saw his military failures, his heavy taxes, and his arbitrary justice. The gap between his projected image of powerful kingship and the reality of his rule grew so wide that the symbols themselves became objects of contempt. This culminated in the Magna Carta, a document that was, in essence, a collective rejection of his propaganda, forcing the king to acknowledge that his power had boundaries. Even the most awe-inspiring architectural projects could backfire spectacularly. A grand new cathedral or a towering castle was meant to symbolize divine favor and unshakable power. But the peasants who hauled the stone and paid the taxes saw only their own exploitation. When the disparity between the patron's glorious vision and the people's suffering became too great, the very monuments meant to intimidate could become triggers for revolt. Extravagant building projects were frequently cited as grievances during peasant uprisings across Europe, as the propaganda of stone ignited the fury of those crushed beneath its weight. The credibility of any message hinges on its connection to the truth, and medieval people were far from gullible. A king who claimed constant divine favor while suffering a string of humiliating military defeats would quickly see his claims become empty boasts. His subjects, hearing of lost battles and burned villages, would soon stop believing the pious images on his coins or the triumphant scenes in his tapestries. The propaganda would be dismissed as a lie, and the ruler's authority would corrode from within. This was a dangerous game. Once the population learned to see through the official story, it became much harder to rally them in a genuine crisis. No institution learned this lesson more harshly than the medieval church during the Black Death. For centuries, its propaganda had been overwhelmingly successful. It controlled the most sacred images, possessed the most powerful relics, and presented itself as the sole gateway to God's mercy. Then the plague arrived. People prayed fervently to the saints depicted in stained glass. They venerated relics believed to have miraculous powers. They attended Mass in the grand cathedrals built to inspire awe. Yet they died in the same horrifying numbers as everyone else. When the Church's promises of protection and intercession collided with the indiscriminate reality of the pandemic, its spiritual authority suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered. The failure of its symbolic tools to effect a physical catastrophe led to widespread disillusionment, the rise of radical reform movements, and a deep, lasting skepticism toward established doctrine. This skepticism was often fed by a flood of competing messages. A peasant living on the border between two rival kingdoms might be subjected to conflicting propaganda from both sides. One lord's coins showed him as a pious and just ruler, while the other's chronicles denounced him as a tyrant. A population caught in the middle of such a war of images could easily become cynical, learning to distrust all official pronouncements and instead relying on their own local networks for information. This environment of competing truths made it difficult for any single power to achieve complete control over the narrative. These failures remind us that the medieval audience was not a blank slate. They were active, critical consumers of the symbols that surrounded them. They accepted messages that aligned with their interests and experiences, and they rejected those that did not. A propaganda campaign could only succeed if it resonated with some underlying social truth or need. When it became unmoored from reality, it risked collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. This adds a crucial layer of realism to our understanding of the past. It cautions us against seeing history as a simple story of rulers effortlessly manipulating the masses. The psychological battlefield was always a two-way street where persuasion could be accepted, ignored, or fiercely contested by the very people it was meant to control. Every color on a medieval canvas was a loaded word in a silent argument. To decode this art, you must first learn its symbolic alphabet. Red was never just red. When used for the robes of a saint, it spoke of martyrdom and sacred blood. But when draped over a king's shoulders, that same crimson signaled raw, earthly power and the right to command life and death. Green was the color of spring and renewal, often associated with hope and fertility, making it a common choice for scenes of paradise or to signify a dynasty's prosperous future. These choices were deliberate, a way for the patron to whisper multiple messages to different viewers simultaneously. A peasant saw the holy red of sacrifice, while a rival noble saw a direct threat in the king's powerful crimson cloak. The hierarchy of power was written directly into the composition itself. Size and placement were everything. The most important figure, whether Christ, a king, or a patron, would be rendered larger than everyone else and placed squarely in the center of the scene. This was not a matter of artistic perspective, but of social perspective. It visually established a chain of command, making the feudal order feel as natural and unchangeable as the painting itself. Surrounding figures would be scaled down according to their status, their smaller forms reinforcing the dominance of the central character. Even the direction a person faced held meaning. A figure gazing directly out at the viewer often sought to create a connection, to invite you into their narrative. A figure shown in profile or turning away could be signaling opposition, sin, or exclusion from the story's moral core. Look closely at the hands and the objects they hold. A saint clutching a key is Saint Peter, the gatekeeper of heaven. A king bearing a sword is not just a warrior, but the embodiment of justice. These attributes were a visual shorthand, instantly communicating a figure's identity, virtue, and role in the divine and earthly order. an artist did not have to write a name underneath a saint. The specific book, wheel, or palm frond they carried told the entire story to an audience trained to read these signs. This system allowed for incredibly efficient storytelling, packing complex theological and political ideas into a single, memorable image. The natural world was also a rich text of hidden meanings. Animals and plants were rarely just decorative. A lion could symbolize the courage of a knight, but it also carried a deeper message of resurrection, based on the popular medieval legend that lion cubs were born dead and brought to life by their father's breath after 3 days. A dog represented fidelity, a fitting symbol at the feet of a noble tomb effigy. The humble lily or fleur de lis was a direct emblem of the Virgin Mary's purity, and by extension, the blessed nature of the French monarchy that adopted it. Every vine, every bird, every mythical creature woven into a tapestry border was a piece of a larger argument about morality, belief, and power. Learning to read this visual vocabulary transforms a passive viewing into an active investigation. You'll begin to see the strategic calculations behind the beauty. That stunning stained glass window is not merely a biblical scene. It is a carefully constructed manifesto on royal legitimacy, where the choice of color, the scale of the figures, and the attributes they hold all conspire to present a specific version of reality. This decoding process unlocks the true purpose of these works. They were never meant to be merely beautiful. They were designed to persuade, to intimidate, and to control, using a language that was universally understood in its time. When you can spot these symbols, you gain the ability to look past the surface and listen to the centuries-old debate happening in pigment and stone. The printing press did not just reproduce words, it shattered the monopoly on truth. For centuries, the power to create persuasive texts had been confined to the slow, expensive scriptoriums of monasteries and royal courts. Then, in the mid-15th century, movable type emerged, and the very speed of information changed forever. A king's proclamation or a pope's decree could now be printed in the hundreds, even thousands, and distributed across a continent in weeks, not years. This was a revolutionary shift from the exclusive, singular manuscript to the mass-produced broadsheet. The medium was no longer a precious object to be revered in a quiet hall, but a disposable leaflet to be read aloud in a bustling town square, its ideas spreading like wildfire among merchants, artisans, and a growing literate class. This new technology, however, did not erase the old strategies. It amplified them. The same visual symbols that once glittered in gold leaf on parchment were now carved into woodblocks and stamped onto cheap paper. A royal coat of arms, a portrait of the Pope, or a map showing a nation's territorial claims could be duplicated and disseminated on an unprecedented scale, uniting far-flung populations under a common set of images. The printing press turned propaganda into a public conversation, and one of its first and most dramatic acts was to dismantle a centuries-old lie. Humanist scholars, armed with new methods of textual criticism, turned their analytical gaze onto the foundational documents of medieval power. They scrutinized the language, the historical references, and the legal formulas in texts like the Donation of Constantine. What they found was devastating. The document was a forgery, a clever fabrication from a later era. The printing press then broadcast this discovery to the world, using the very technology the Church had long dominated to systematically undermine its claim to temporal authority. This was a profound crisis of legitimacy, proving that the written word, once the bedrock of power, could now become its most potent enemy. Even as old certainties crumbled, the art of the portrait evolved to serve new masters. Renaissance artists began to depict rulers with a startling psychological realism. No longer were they just idealized icons of office. You could see the shrewd intelligence in the eyes of a Medici banker, the weary resolve of a Tudor queen, the calculated ambition of a French king. This new individualism was itself a powerful tool. It suggested that this specific person, with their unique character and intellect, was uniquely qualified to lead. The propaganda became more sophisticated, arguing for personal merit alongside, or even above, divine right. Yet the goal remained the same: to build an emotional connection between the ruler and the ruled, making their authority feel both human and indispensable. This focus on the individual ruler was part of a larger shift toward the nation-state. As feudal bonds weakened, propaganda began to emphasize a shared patriotic identity. Art and printed texts encouraged people to think of themselves not merely as subjects of a local lord, but as Englishmen, Frenchmen, or Spaniards. Maps glorified national borders, literature celebrated vernacular languages, and royal portraits were deliberately circulated to make the monarch's face the recognizable symbol of the nation itself. This was a grand project of unification, using imagery to weave diverse duchies and counties into a single, cohesive whole loyal to a central crown. The tools had changed, but the fundamental purpose of medieval propaganda, to legitimize power, demonize rivals, and command loyalty, remained utterly unchanged. The Renaissance did not invent political persuasion. It simply gave it a new set of brushes and a much larger canvas, proving that the drive to shape reality through images is a timeless human endeavor. A single piece of parchment could command an army, and a splash of crimson paint could sanctify a tyrant. These were not passive records of history, but active weapons in a relentless war for the human mind. The true lesson of medieval propaganda is that power does not reside solely in armies or treasuries, but in the ability to craft a story so compelling it becomes reality itself. The Bayeux Tapestry did not just depict the Norman conquest, it justified it for 1,000 years. An illuminated gospel did not merely spread faith, it embedded a king's face into the story of salvation. These artifacts prove that winning hearts and minds was never a secondary strategy, but the foundation of lasting control. The rulers and clerics of the Middle Ages were masters of a sophisticated language, using symbols to build loyalty, narratives to demonize rivals, and psychological triggers to make their authority feel as natural as the sunrise. This visual engineering shaped the destiny of Europe, creating legacies of legitimacy that would endure for centuries. We now live in a world saturated with their intellectual airs. The bold colors of a political campaign, the imposing architecture of a government building, the carefully curated portrait of a leader, these are all descendants of the heraldic banner and the royal seal. The strategies have been refined for new media, but the core objective remains unchanged: to persuade, to legitimize, and to command allegiance. This historical understanding arms us with a critical lens. When we see a powerful image, we can now ask the deeper questions. What reality is this trying to build? What interests does this story serve? The art of medieval propaganda teaches us that truth is perpetually contested on the battlefield of imagery. To recognize these ancient techniques in our modern visual culture is to become a more discerning citizen, capable of separating message from manipulation. Let this journey into the persuasive power of the past inspire you to look more deeply at the art that surrounds you. Question the stories told in stone, on screens, and in print. Understand that every powerful image carries a history, and every history was once a weapon. If this exploration has changed how you see the hidden narratives woven into our world, share your perspective and join the conversation about the enduring architecture of power.